Good evening. My name is Terry Alford, and welcome to Our Story. It's so exciting to know that for so many of you, as you unwind and get prepared for your dinners, you've welcomed us into your homes to listen to what's happening in the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor, as well as on the east side of Buffalo. Our Story is just another one of those forums to keep you all informed. Again, Our Story will air at this time every Thursday evening, right here at WUFO, Radio Power 96.5 FM. Our Story will feature guests, unknown facts, treasure stories, and themes that provide insight into the historic Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor. Join us and learn about the latest happenings in the corridor and meet the proud and resilient men and women living or conducting business within and around our historic neighborhoods on the east side of Buffalo. Tonight, our guests are Reverend Eugene Pierce, past commander of the Jesse Clipper American Legion Post, and Dr. Diane Cookfair, a local epidemiologist and clinical researcher, now retired, who devotes all of her time to historic research. Welcome, Reverend and Doctor.
Thank you so much, Terry.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you for being here. So it's really an honor to have you both here talking about a subject that is really near and dear to my heart since coming on board as Executive Director of the Corridor. It's the Jesse Clipper story. And a lot of our listening audience may not know who Jesse Clipper is. So I'm excited that you're both here to maybe shed a light on Jesse Clipper. He's more than the Jesse Clipper Memorial Park and Square that's over here on William and Michigan Street. So again, I'm quite excited with these two folks coming on tonight. So first I'll start with Diane. What we like to do here at the show is give you an opportunity to maybe share a little bit about your story, and then I'm going to turn over to Reverend to get his story.
Okay, well, I'm originally from Buffalo. We moved around a lot when I was a kid and eventually moved back here. I got my background is that I got my PhD in epidemiology, and one of the things you learn how to do is you learn research skills. Mm-hmm. And as I had extra time, I started devoting that to family genealogy, and a lot of those techniques is what I used to research Jesse Clipper. Mm-hmm. Reverend Pierce and I both share an interest in that kind of thing, and I like to pursue other things, and finally had the time for it. And the reason I got interested in Jesse Clipper was actually had to be at least 15 years ago, because I was driving by Jesse Clipper Square with my goddaughter. She was about 8, and as little kids do, she said, "What's that place, that park?" And I said, "Well, it's Jesse Clipper's park." "Who's Jesse Clipper?" "Well, he was a soldier and he was a musician like your daddy." And she said, "Oh." And she seized on the musician part and asked me, "What instrument did he play?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but I'll find out." I think she's long since forgotten the question. She's almost ready to graduate from college. But I started looking, and it took me a long time. The answer to that, by the way, was the trombone. He primarily, before coming to Buffalo, was a vaudeville star who did comedy, dancing, singing, but it took a long time to get to that, and the more I looked, the more interesting he got, because there was so little known about him, and he was a fascinating individual, and I think an American hero.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get to the rest of that story in a moment. So Reverend, who are you? What's your story?
Well, I guess I do have a story. I have a master's degree in American Studies from the University of Buffalo, and this was provided to me by way of the educational rights I had as a veteran. With 18 and a half years of military service, I've seen a lot, both positive and negative, and for that reason, once I began to read about Jesse Clipper, I found a unique individual, so much that you don't find soldiers like he was every day. So I'm here to tell the story of Jesse Clipper. Yes, Jesse Clipper.
And just like Jesse, he was a veteran, and he died as a result of injuries suffered in World War I. As are you, you're a veteran. What branch did you serve?
He was Army and I was Army as well.
Mm-hmm. And I want to prod you a little bit for the listening audience, because when I first met you, you told me, in your early years as a soldier, there were two individuals that you had the pleasure of meeting. You'd like to share those individuals?
Yes, well, when I reported to basic training at Fort Hood, Texas in 1958, the trainee standing next to me was Elvis Presley. And I think that happened because the P is the first alphabet in both of our names. The other thing that was kind of unique was my hometown is Laurel, Mississippi, and his hometown, Tupelo, Mississippi. So after we completed basic training, we went by ship to the northern port of Bremerhaven, Germany. And from there I shipped down to Gelnhausen, Germany, part of the 58th Infantry Division, and who was the company commander, First Lieutenant Colin Powell. And Colin had just graduated from the City College of New York. He was in the ROTC, and this was his first assignment, was as the company commander there in Gelnhausen, West Germany.
Thank you for sharing that. That's why stories are so great. Everyone carries their own personal stories, and everyone's stories is important and just really colorful. So thank you both for sharing with the audience. So let's get into Jesse Clipper's story. So Diane, you sort of started talking about Jesse. I know you did a deep dive.
I did, and it was like into the rabbit hole, because the more I learned, the more intrigued I was, because he wasn't the person that people here in Buffalo assumed he was. He sort of showed up here in 1915, and he was young for his age. He like a lot of people who have been in the entertainment industry, you don't always tell people exactly how old you are. You sort of make it a little younger. So he was a dancer. He was in good shape physically, and so people assumed he probably came up from the South as part of the diaspora that happened at that time. And they also assumed that after he started to establish his musical career here, that he was a new musician, at least over time. I'm sure that the people then knew differently. But they assumed he was new and just starting out, younger than he was, and that he was drafted. And all of that was wrong.
Okay.
There were reasons people thought that. He hadn't been here for very long. He had traveled, he'd been born in Utah in 1882. Okay. And he had, his family, his grandparents in particular, after the Civil War, had traveled west instead of north. Eventually, his grandfather first helped build railroads in Omaha, Nebraska, and then became a porter. And their family lived with his grandparents until they died. So he was a major figure. But Clipper's father had been a slave. His grandparents had both been slaves. His mother, who was the youngest of her generation, was the only one who'd been born after emancipation. So they valued things like service, being able to vote. It was not taken for granted, and I think from the things I've learned about his childhood, this was something that they passed on to him and wanted him, these were values they passed on to him. I know you had some questions about what he did, and our time here is too short to really get into a deep dive on that, but he was working in the entertainment industry from the time he was a child. He and his brother ended up working for some very famous vaudeville stars, and he was one of the talented group of black children that were sometimes brought on to help shore up the careers of aging vaudeville stars. In his case, both white and black. And it wasn't an easy thing to do because he was traveling pretty much unsupervised, as were the other children, but it was a way to get an education in entertainment.
So was he married?
He was married 3 times. His first two marriages they ended in tragedy. You know, he didn't have an easy life. His first wife, Lillian Carson, who he married in 1904 in California, she died in Seattle, Washington in January of 1908 at the age of 19. And this was something, the whole incident surrounding her death said a lot about Clipper and his bravery. A friend of theirs who'd been coming home was stalked by someone who was trying to attack her. And Clipper had been out performing, probably at a local pub or something else, because he was working as a solo act at that point. And he was on his way home, and the newspaper articles described him as being in his three-piece suit when he got in and found that the individual, this friend of theirs, had taken refuge in the boarding house where they lived to try to get away from this person who was trying to attack her. And he walked into the room they had at the boarding house where his wife and their friend was, and this man was attacking them. He had a knife, and Clipper just, with his bare hands, got in, overpowered him, stopped him, had him arrested. Unfortunately, his wife was stabbed. She went into the hospital where she developed TB, and it deteriorated rapidly. And that was the story, and she was very young when she died. After that, he married a second time to a woman from Tacoma, Washington named Della Tanner. And they began doing a vaudeville act together. And from all the reviews I've read, they had something more than just talent. They had real chemistry together on stage. And before work.
So they were going all around the country?
All around the country. And first they went from the West Coast to Chicago, where they based themselves, because there was a big group of people in Chicago where there were actually some clubs with standing bands that were located at hotels and the like. And eventually they moved their base to New York City, which in the Harlem area. But they traveled from there to cities all over the United States, very intensely for a couple of years, until Della Tanner Clipper became ill and with some sort of chronic disease that I haven't been able to identify. They were married in 1909, and she died at the age of 23 in November of 1914. And it was shortly after that that Jesse Clipper came to Buffalo. He had some friends here from the sounds of things, and basically he was starting over. He could have gone on as an independent vaudeville star. He had the talent for that. There were people who wanted him. But I think at that point, after he lost his second wife, he was ready to settle down and wanted to build a different kind of career, a musical career where he could be in one city, be in one place, and have a different kind of life. And he came to Buffalo because he thought it had promise.
Right.
And here he married Edna Mercer in 1916, who was from Buffalo.
Okay.
And they were still married at the time that he died.
So is this, how did he find himself in World War I?
Oh, this is another story that shows something about his courage and his ability to set his mind on something. When they held the first draft, which was on June 5th, 1917, it was limited to men from the ages of 21 to 31. And Jesse Clipper was too old to be drafted. He was already almost 35, and in the 1917, that was actually not quite, that wasn't young or middle age, that was late middle age, which is why the draft was limited to 31. But, so he couldn't go through the draft, and he clearly felt that service to his country was important, as did many African Americans in World War I. You have to remember it was a little more than 50 years since slavery had ended. So service, and Reverend Pierce, please jump in.
Oh, I'm gonna swing by to him.
Service at that time was considered, for African Americans, it was considered one way. Whether they were right or not after the war is open to question, but it was considered one way to try to establish themselves as full citizens of the United States. Because the right to bear arms, there were a lot of people that were very nervous at that time about having black men being trained to shoot, to fight and to serve. And there were others who felt that they didn't have what it took. Because you have to remember that the people who went into the military included lots of people from the South who still had views that were fairly limited. So it wasn't an easy time. And what happened initially was, after the first group of people joined, a large group within the first week of declaring war, they stopped allowing black men to enlist and said, you all have to come in through the draft. Because they wanted to use them in labor positions rather than, they still needed them. And if you read newspapers from that time, like the New York Age or Chicago Defender, you'll find the editorials noting that people were very unhappy, and the black community throughout the country felt that they should have a division of black troops who were fighting men. And since they didn't want people avoiding the draft for the other purposes, they established one division. And in that division was a group of combat engineers.
Okay.
And they tried to get everybody by drafting them, mostly from Ohio, but they needed a certain level of education. And as it turned out, when he lived in California, Jesse Clipper had spent, I don't know how much time he went there, and the school is now closed, but there was a business and engineering college that he attended for at least a semester. So they recruited about 250 black men to serve in this combat engineer regiment. And they put a letter out and said, write to me, to a certain colonel who was going to be in charge, and tell me why you should be in our unit. And then you just waited to see if you were going to be invited. Well, I'm not quite sure what was in the letter he wrote, but I'm sure it was compelling. He was called up. Once you were called, you couldn't change your mind. That was that.
Right.
No matter how old you were. But I think he felt a need to serve, and I think that came out of his family. And Reverend Pierce, you had some comments on that also.
Yeah, so as a soldier yourself, and being an African American soldier, obviously, you know, I know you're a student of Jesse as well. You know, could you maybe share with the audience, you know, some of the things that African American soldiers might have been facing at that time in World War I, especially segregated units, and as Diane mentioned, you know, how these folks were drafted in, you know, just to be labor and not, you know, soldiers per se.
Yes, Terry, if I could, though, I'd like to go back and with the thought that where we are in the historic area in Buffalo, and across, well, next door is a colored musician club.
Yes.
And this club was organized by Jesse Clipper. And what he found was in Buffalo, black musicians were not allowed to join a labor organization, and they couldn't get prevailing wages. So he organized AFL-CIO 553. That's still an active, very active branches of the AFL-CIO.
Yes, it is.
So after organizing the union, he took a leave, yes, and went into service.
And I say too, he was a member of the church as well, wasn't he?
Well, I'm
the
not-
Michigan Street Baptist Church.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. I
Right.
don't know. But he volunteered, went into military service, and it was not by mistake that he was in the engineers. And when we say engineers, we sometimes think about roads and bridges, but the engineers, they would erect small homes, houses. They would also clear roads, and at times it was like being a member of the road gang when you were in confinement. So it was not a glorious job that he was a part of. The other thing is to be promoted to the rank of corporal E4. That didn't happen that often.
Right.
So apparently his educational skills, attainment were excellent. But I had a situation back in 2017. Being a member of the Jesse Clipper Post, and I was commander for 2 terms, I was baffled by things like his name. Is it Jesse Clipper? Is it Jesse? And so I said, well, you know, in order to find out what's what, I need to go to his grave and check it out. So in 2017, I went to his grave, which is located 70 miles south of Paris, France, in the Picardy region. And he's buried there along with 6,200 soldiers and Marines. And to realize that here was a man that left home, didn't have to, fought for a country that did not allow him to drink out of a faucet with cold water. He had to drink hot water. But yet, he went, he fought, and he died. His death was caused by being poison gas by German troops, and that was a real problem at that time. But Jesse Clipper, he was a man of men, and I'm so proud of being a part of it. And Terry, I can't tell you how it felt to stand there at his grave and the witness, yes, Jesse Wallace Clipper, Corporal E4,
Yes.
is buried here.
Yes.
And if at some point I would like to do a pilgrimage back to that grave, if it's not every year, every 5 years.
That would be a great thing.
Yeah, go back and the grave and the monument is situated in a place of pride. As a matter of fact, 80% of all French champagne
Yeah.
is distilled in that area. And as a matter of fact, when I was traveling from Germany down to France, I would go through these distilleries, and there was a sign, "Come and taste." I didn't taste because I would have lost my way. But it's nice that the French government would set aside this prized land to contain the graves of our brave soldiers and Marines.
Are there other soldiers of color buried there as well that you know, if you know?
No, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
There are some, when I was looking at records of who might be buried there,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes when the individuals were in hospital for a long time, like Clipper was, because after being gassed, he developed.
And he was injured more than
He was
just one
injured
time,
more
right?
than
Yeah,
that. He was
right.
injured probably by shrapnel or snipers, because the combat engineer unit he was in worked at the front or beyond the front doing all these nasty jobs. They built railroad tracks. They cut barbed wire in
Right.
no man's land.
Right.
Half the time they had to, their officers would take them, who were all white, would lead them into German supply dumps to get tools they needed,
Really?
because they didn't have clippers that could get through the German barbed wire. They were in dangerous things. They cleared out trenches where gas shell had been shelled in. So people were constantly, it was either sniper fire or they were shelled, because if you stop the engineers, you stop the troops from going forward or from getting their supplies.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they had to work at night. They were constantly, they were separated from the regiment. There was such a need for combat engineers that the Army Corps of Engineers started moving them around, whoever needed them.
Mhm.
They would support French troops, they would support American troops. So they were at the front lines or beyond it for most of the time they were there.
Go ahead, Reverend.
Yeah, what I wanted to say was, as we look at Jesse Clipper and how do his legacy continue,
Mm-hmm.
what can we do as a community?
Yes, sir.
Because he gave it all. Some gave some, he gave it all. So how do we give back? And it's sad to see situations such as the Jesse Clipper building that at one point was on, on, it was
I think
on,
Genesee was it?
it was on, Genesee near Spring.
Right.
And it almost occupied a block. It provided place for wedding receptions, youth programs, and the teaching of the military way, which I think is the best form of leadership you can have to assist, especially young boys and in some cases young girls, to become meaningful in life, to understand the dynamics of leadership, the responsibilities of leadership, and just to be responsible, period. So hopefully we will resurrect Jesse Clipper, so to speak, here in the quarter, because we have Jesse Clipper Square
Yes.
down the street here.
When was the square dedicated?
1935.
1935.
Yes,
Okay.
a group of black veterans got together and paid for that monument. There's a lot that we can do centered around just veterans and a veterans' way of life. And we are now doing things such as providing honor guard services. We provide, excuse me, what we call we call the burial with honors. So whether it's the honor guard, whether it's the color guard, or whether it's the final salute, we want to let veterans know their service is appreciated by the community, and we're going to make sure when you move to the eternal post, you will move there with all due speed and with military honors.
Yes, sir. That would be a wonderful thing once we can get that post back established, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Be a great
yes.
thing. And by the way, before we close, I want to thank you for your service, obviously. You represent so many of your posts, so many around the country in terms of, all that you've given and sacrificed, for this country, for your communities and things. So, we always like to say we stand on shoulders who's come before us. And, I know you and so many other soldiers are standing on Jesse's shoulders. So, it's a great tribute that I stand on your shoulders. I'm a little heavy. But it's good to be able to stand on yours nonetheless. I never had the pleasure of serving. I had relatives that did so, but always speaking to them even today in terms of the great things that occurred and the benefits that they realize as a result of serving is just so much greater than that. So thank you for that. So Diane, what are you looking to do now with the Jesse story?
Well, as Reverend Pierce was indicating, the legacy of Jesse Clipper is important. I mean, he clearly was making Buffalo his home. He was settling for the first time in his life. And he would have come back here, and I think he would have continued to build his career as an independent band leader and singer,
Right.
which is where he was going as he reinvented himself. So I think he would be really proud to have a post like this as his legacy and the many things that happened as a result of that. And so right now, I've been working with Reverend Pierce to film oral histories put together into a film of Post members, including of the various members of Jesse Clipper
Great,
Post
great.
who are still alive, as well as some reviews of people who have passed on. And we are also starting to work on an article on the legacy of Jesse Clipper here in Buffalo, with a focus on the history of the Jesse Clipper American Legion Post, which over the years has been a major force itself in the Buffalo community.
Well, that's fantastic. That sounds great. Before we sign off, I want to give the good Reverend, the past commander of the post, the last word before I actually officially sign off. Anything you want to leave the audience with?
Well, I want to leave them with the realization that the possibilities are great regarding the building of a new facility for Jesse Clipper business, as well as for an African American Veterans Museum. It's more than due because of the realization of what is possible. And I'd like to leave you with the thought that get out of your comfort zone and get into the progressive zone. It won't hurt you at all.
Thank you, Reverend. Well, that's the end of our show tonight. We'd again like to thank Reverend Eugene Pierce and Dr. Diane Cookfair again for being such great guests with us tonight. If you'd like more information about our Heritage Corridor, please visit us online at michiganstreetbuffalo.org or just simply call our office at 716-322-1002. So please enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.